Imagine walking for weeks through a landscape that seems determined to turn you back. The trail has disappeared beneath snow twice. One of the pack animals is gone. At night the temperature falls so quickly that water freezes beside the fire, and every morning another wall of mountains waits beyond the one you crossed yesterday. Then, shortly before sunrise, your guide stops. He has spent most of the journey saying very little, but now he points toward a narrow opening between two black Himalayan peaks. There is no road through it. Only prayer flags snapping violently in the wind and a ledge disappearing into cloud. He tells you that beyond this point maps become unreliable. You climb anyway. The ledge rises. The air thins. The clouds close around you until the world becomes white. Then sunlight breaks through, and for several seconds something appears far below. Not another frozen valley. Green. Water. Terraces. Buildings. Perhaps a roof catching the sunrise. Then the cloud moves and it is gone. For centuries, stories surrounding Tibet and Central Asia have carried variations of an extraordinary possibility. Somewhere beyond the ordinary world lies Shambhala, a kingdom protected from those who are not prepared to reach it. But the real story is stranger than the modern fantasy of a secret city hidden from satellites, because Shambhala did not begin as an explorer's rumor. Its deepest surviving roots lie inside the Kalachakra tradition of Buddhism, where kings, cosmology, prophecy, spiritual transformation and geography become almost impossible to separate. According to that tradition, a ruler named Suchandra traveled from Shambhala to India to receive teachings from the Buddha and returned carrying knowledge that would be preserved in his kingdom. Centuries later, those teachings entered the historical record in India and traveled into Tibet, bringing Shambhala with them. The descriptions were tantalizingly specific. A land surrounded by mountains. Regions arranged around a center. Cities and villages. A royal capital. A succession of rulers. A society preserving teachings while the world outside moved through cycles of disorder. It sounded enough like geography to tempt people to search for it, yet enough like sacred cosmology to make every map inadequate. And that tension created one of history's most durable legends. If Shambhala were merely heaven, there would be little reason to search the Himalayas. If it were merely a forgotten city, archaeology might eventually settle the question. But Shambhala lives somewhere between those possibilities. Some traditions describe a journey toward it, yet virtue and spiritual preparation become as important as distance. Some descriptions make the kingdom feel astonishingly physical, while their deeper meaning points inward. Later writers added new interpretations. Western seekers mixed Shambhala with other hidden world traditions. Fiction created Shangri-La. Explorers stared at blank spaces on maps. Mountains that had concealed ordinary valleys for millennia suddenly seemed capable of concealing something extraordinary. But before we search for Shambhala, we have to find the moment when the story truly begins. And that means leaving modern Tibet behind. We must go back to India, to a sacred teaching, a king from a northern realm, and an encounter that tradition says changed the destiny of an entire hidden kingdom. Because the first person in the Shambhala story was not an explorer trying to get in. He was a king who supposedly came out. Part 1: The King Who Came from Shambhala. The traditional story begins far from the snowy image most people associate with Shambhala. In southern India, at a place remembered in the Kalachakra tradition as Danyakataka, the Buddha is said to have given an extraordinary teaching concerning Kalachakra, the wheel of time. Among those who came to receive it was King Suchandra. He was not described as a wandering hermit or a mysterious stranger without a homeland. He arrived as the ruler of Shambhala, accompanied in traditional accounts by representatives of its many regions. This detail changes the atmosphere immediately. Shambhala is not introduced as an abandoned city waiting to be discovered. It is already organized, inhabited and ruled. Suchandra's reason for coming is equally important. He is said to have wanted a path that would allow people with responsibilities to pursue profound spiritual development without abandoning ordinary life. He receives the teaching, returns to his kingdom and preserves it there. Tradition attributes to him the composition of a vast root tantra and commentary, texts that are said to have later been lost. Historically, we cannot stand outside Danyakataka and verify this meeting as an ordinary recorded event. The surviving Kalachakra textual tradition appears much later, around the turn of the second millennium. That distinction must remain clear. But now enter the legend as its believers encountered it. Picture Suchandra returning north. The journey stretches across plains, rivers and kingdoms until the terrain begins to rise. His caravan becomes smaller as roads narrow. Warm valleys give way to stone. Snow appears on distant summits. Somewhere beyond the known routes lies the country he rules. When the king finally reaches Shambhala, the image offered by later tradition is astonishing. This is not a crude mountain refuge. It is a vast realm protected by geography, divided into regions and filled with settlements. At its heart stands a capital associated with the Kalachakra mandala. Knowledge brought from India is not hidden in a cave and forgotten, it becomes part of a living lineage. Suchandra eventually dies, but Shambhala does not vanish with him. Other kings follow. Generations pass. The kingdom becomes inseparable from the preservation of the teaching. And here the legend acquires something most mythical places never receive: continuity. Atlantis is remembered through destruction. El Dorado became an obsession through gold. Shambhala survives through succession. One ruler hands something to another. A teaching moves through time while the world outside changes. That is why the Wheel of Time is such an appropriate doorway into the story. Kalachakra is concerned with cycles in the cosmos, cycles within human existence, and methods intended to transform our relationship to those cycles. The kingdom preserving those teachings also moves through cycles of rulers and eras. Nothing stays still. Even paradise exists inside time. Hundreds of years after Suchandra, according to the traditional lineage, another ruler emerges whose decisions transform Shambhala again, Manjushri Yashas, remembered as the first of the Kalki rulers. Under him, the kingdom becomes connected not only with preservation but with unity and preparation for a distant future. Suddenly Shambhala is no longer simply guarding knowledge from the past. It is preparing for something that has not happened yet. And once a hidden kingdom is given a future, people outside it begin to wonder whether somewhere, beyond the mountains, its clock is still running. Part 2, The Kingdom Behind the Mountains. If the story ended with a sacred teaching preserved in an invisible realm, Shambhala might have remained primarily a theological idea. But descriptions gave the imagination architecture. Tibetan cosmological representations associated with Kalachakra portray Shambhala as a great land north of familiar sacred geography, enclosed by mountains and organized with almost unnerving precision. In one celebrated visual tradition, it resembles an 8-petaled lotus. Each petal contains regions, the regions contain rulers and enormous numbers of villages, and at the center lies the capital with the Kalachakra mandala palace. Stop there and imagine being a traveler hearing this centuries before aerial photography. You are not being told merely that enlightened beings exist somewhere beyond the world. You are being given a country. Mountains surround it. People live there. Roads must connect settlements. Fields must feed them. Water must descend from the surrounding heights. Children must grow into adults who have never seen the lands you call home. Somewhere at the center, rulers make decisions while manuscripts are copied and teachings continue. The physical imagination almost builds Shambhala by itself. Enormous snowy ranges form an outer wall. Inside, elevation falls and the climate softens. Glacial rivers descend into a protected basin. Forests appear. Villages occupy fertile terraces. Monasteries rise above stone roads. Caravans move between districts. At sunrise, golden roofs catch light long before the valley floor. Nothing needs to float. Nothing needs to glow. The impossible thing is simply that this world could exist and remain hidden. To a modern audience, that seems difficult to accept. We have satellite imagery, aircraft and global positioning. But the legend developed in a radically different geographical imagination. For much of history, distance was not measured by how quickly information crossed it but by how difficult a human body found the terrain. A mountain range could separate worlds. Snow could erase a trail in an afternoon. A river could make a route impassable for months. A guide refusing to continue could matter more than a map. The Himalayas and the vast regions of Central Asia contained enough genuine isolation to make extraordinary stories believable. Yet the most fascinating part of Shambhala is that the tradition does not simply reward the determined mountaineer. The closer the seeker comes, the more ordinary geography begins to fail. Accounts and later guide traditions concerning the route toward Shambhala include obstacles that are not overcome merely by stronger legs or better equipment. Spiritual qualification matters. Purification matters. What kind of person is traveling begins to matter as much as where that person is traveling. The map begins outside you and somehow ends inside you. That is the trap waiting for anyone who treats Shambhala like a lost railway station. You can measure mountains. You can follow rivers. You can search valleys. But what instrument measures whether the traveler is ready to arrive? Imagine reaching the final pass after months of hardship only to discover that the last barrier is not ice, altitude or distance. It is you. At that moment Shambhala changes from a hidden country into something more unsettling, a place that might be perfectly visible and still inaccessible. And that idea would prove almost impossible for later seekers to resist. Part 3, The Rulers and the Prophecy. A hidden kingdom becomes more compelling when it is given names, generations and a destiny. In the Kalachakra tradition, Suchandra is followed by other rulers, and eventually Manjushri Yashas becomes the first of a line of Kalki kings. His son Pundarika is associated with the great commentary known as the Stainless Light. These names matter because the legend does not describe Shambhala as frozen perfection. It has history. Kings inherit responsibility. Teachings are interpreted. Society must be held together. The title Kalki itself enters a complicated religious landscape shared with Indian traditions, but within Kalachakra the rulers become guardians of a kingdom whose future is tied to a world outside its borders. And then the story darkens. Human history moves through conflict. Societies fracture. Violence expands. According to the prophetic dimension of the tradition, a future age arrives when destructive forces threaten the world. Shambhala, hidden for generations, is no longer permitted to remain merely hidden. A future ruler, Rudra Chakran, the 25th Kalki, becomes associated with the decisive confrontation after which the Kalachakra teachings flourish. It is easy for modern retellings to turn this into a fantasy battle scene and miss what gives the prophecy its emotional force. The deeper tension is that Shambhala's isolation has a purpose. Imagine a kingdom whose people grow up knowing that their safety is temporary. Beyond their mountains, civilizations rise and fall. Armies move. Faiths change. Generations inside Shambhala inherit a story telling them that one day the boundary between their protected world and the suffering outside it will collapse. A child looking from a palace terrace toward the mountains might know that those peaks are not only walls keeping strangers out. They are walls holding history back. Every peaceful market, every monastery library, every field being harvested exists under the shadow of a future obligation. This transforms Shambhala from escapism into responsibility. A paradise that exists only to hide from suffering is one thing. A protected realm preserving something because the outside world may eventually need it is another. That distinction helps explain why the legend survived periods of upheaval. When ordinary institutions fail, people become fascinated by the possibility that somewhere knowledge has survived intact. We see versions of this impulse throughout history: lost libraries, hidden heirs, secret archives, monasteries protecting manuscripts while kingdoms burn. Shambhala gathers those instincts into an entire civilization. Yet the prophecy also creates danger for anyone telling the story carelessly. Religious imagery written in particular historical contexts can be distorted into simplistic predictions about modern peoples or modern wars. Historia will not do that. The important fact for our journey is what the prophecy does to the kingdom's narrative role. It makes Shambhala a reservoir of continuity during an age of decline. It waits. Its rulers count forward. Its teachings remain alive. And somewhere in the imagination of those who accepted the tradition, the hidden kingdom was not disappearing into the past. It was approaching from the future. Now consider what that does to a traveler who believes the story. He is no longer searching for ruins. If Shambhala exists, its gates may still be guarded. Its people may still be living. And somewhere beyond those mountains, a king may still be waiting for a date the outside world has forgotten. Part 4, The Map That Refuses to Be a Map. Centuries pass, and the question becomes irresistible: If Shambhala is described as a land, where is it? This sounds simple until someone actually tries to answer it. Place it too literally on a modern map and the legend collapses under geography. Push it entirely into a spiritual dimension and the detailed descriptions of mountains, regions, rulers and journeys become difficult to explain away as decoration. The most interesting possibility is that Shambhala was never required to choose between those categories. Sacred geography often works differently from modern cartography. A mountain can be rock and symbol simultaneously. A pilgrimage can move a person across actual land while also changing the person who walks it. A city can occupy a place in religious imagination without behaving like a city that can be located by longitude and latitude. Shambhala seems to thrive in exactly this borderland. Later Tibetan guide traditions describing journeys toward it could sound tantalizingly practical at first: directions, regions, landscapes, obstacles. A determined reader might spread a map across a table, compare rivers, measure mountain chains and convince himself that the clues are beginning to align. Then the road becomes stranger. Moral and spiritual preparation enters the journey. Practices become necessary. The seeker's inner condition becomes part of the route. Imagine the frustration of an explorer who has crossed half a continent only to discover that the final instruction is not turn east at the river but transform yourself. You cannot hire a porter to carry that requirement. You cannot buy it from a caravan. You cannot photograph it. This is where the legend becomes almost mischievous. Every attempt to reduce Shambhala to coordinates strips away the very mechanism that keeps it hidden. The kingdom does not need an invisible force field. It needs a definition of accessibility that ordinary exploration cannot satisfy. A person could theoretically stand near the right mountains and remain infinitely far away. This is also why claims that someone has found Shambhala deserve scrutiny. Real Himalayan valleys can be spectacular enough to inspire the comparison. Remote communities can preserve traditions outsiders barely understand. Archaeology can uncover forgotten settlements. None of those discoveries automatically becomes the Shambhala of Kalachakra. The evidence must carry that weight, not our desire for the story to be true. But refusing false certainty does not make the journey less exciting. Imagine a manuscript in a monastery library describing a northern route. A scholar translates a place name. Another text appears to point toward a different region. A traveler hears that an elderly lama knows a path but will not describe it. A merchant insists there is nothing beyond a certain pass. Then another man quietly says his grandfather crossed it and returned speaking about a valley where winter seemed unable to enter. One clue contradicts another. The map fills with possibilities until it becomes almost useless. And that may be exactly where Shambhala wants us, standing before the mountains with enough information to continue, but never enough to know whether the next valley is a destination or another test. Part 5, When Outsiders Enter the Legend. Eventually Shambhala escaped the world that had preserved it. Travelers, scholars, occult writers and adventurers encountered fragments of Tibetan and Central Asian traditions and carried them into entirely different intellectual cultures. Something predictable happened: the story changed. The West had its own appetite for hidden worlds. 19th and early 20th century readers were fascinated by blank spaces on maps, secret brotherhoods, ancient wisdom and civilizations supposedly concealed beyond the reach of modern society. Shambhala entered this atmosphere and began collecting ideas that had not originally belonged to it. It was mixed with Agartha, an underground kingdom from later esoteric traditions. It was associated with secret masters and hidden networks. Eventually another name entered popular imagination: Shangri-La. James Hilton's 1933 novel Lost Horizon presented a fictional Himalayan refuge whose inhabitants lived apart from the turmoil of the world. Shangri-La became so culturally powerful that it began swallowing older traditions around it. To many people, Shambhala and Shangri-La became nearly interchangeable: beautiful valley, inaccessible mountains, enlightened inhabitants, extraordinary longevity, secret entrance. But they are not simply two ancient names for the same place. Shangri-La is modern fiction. Shambhala has a much older place within Kalachakra tradition. Confusing them makes the story easier but poorer. The transformation itself, however, tells us something important. Every culture that encountered Shambhala seems to have placed something of itself inside the kingdom. Religious practitioners saw a realm connected to spiritual attainment. Esoteric writers saw hidden masters. Adventurers saw unexplored geography. Novelists saw utopia. Modern conspiracy culture sometimes sees secret technology or underground civilizations for which reliable evidence simply does not exist. The kingdom became a mirror. And mirrors tell us as much about the observer as the object. Picture an early 20th century traveler approaching Tibet with notebooks, cameras and maps. He has read stories about hidden valleys. Every monastery on a distant ridge becomes interesting. Every local hesitation sounds like concealment. A storm closes a pass and suddenly weather feels like a guardian. A guide refuses a route and suspicion replaces common sense. This is how legends can begin controlling what explorers think they see. Yet occasionally the landscape itself seems to cooperate. The Himalayas produce valleys of almost impossible beauty. A traveler can move from barren high-altitude terrain into protected regions filled with forests and water. Monasteries can appear where no building seemed possible. Clouds can conceal an entire mountainside and reveal it seconds later. You do not need supernatural geography to understand why someone standing there might believe. But belief is not evidence. No authenticated expedition has returned with archaeological proof of a functioning hidden kingdom matching the Shambhala of Kalachakra. No verified palace has been excavated. No surviving population has been identified as its citizens. The search therefore reaches an uncomfortable point. The more thoroughly the physical world is mapped, the less room remains for a conventional secret kingdom. Yet Shambhala refuses to die. Instead of becoming smaller, it retreats into the one territory modern exploration cannot photograph, meaning. Part 6, The Kingdom Inside the Seeker. Suppose you finally reach the valley. After months of cold, exhaustion and uncertainty, the mountains open and everything the stories promise lies below you. White monasteries climb the slopes. Rivers shine through green terraces. Golden roofs catch the morning sun. Bells carry across the valley. Nobody is surprised by your arrival because, somehow, they knew that if you reached the final pass you were already capable of entering. What happens next? Most adventure stories end here. The lost city is found. The treasure chamber opens. The map is proven correct. Shambhala becomes more interesting because arrival would only begin the real question. Why was the kingdom hidden from you in the first place? Kalachakra does not concern itself merely with external geography. Its structure links external cycles of the cosmos with internal cycles associated with the human being and with alternative cycles connected to transformative practice. The outer world and inner world echo one another. Seen from that perspective, Shambhala's inaccessible geography begins to acquire another dimension. Mountains can represent obstacles without ceasing to be mountains. The journey can be physically imagined while pointing toward internal transformation. The hidden kingdom becomes less like a prize and more like a condition. This does not mean we should flatten the tradition into the modern slogan that Shambhala is inside all of us. That would be another simplification. The traditional material gives Shambhala far richer cosmological and geographical form than a motivational metaphor. But it does mean that searching only the external landscape may leave half the story untouched. Think again about the traveler at the pass. At the beginning, he believed endurance would be enough. He bought better clothing, hired guides, collected maps, learned routes. Each obstacle seemed external. Snow, hunger, distance, fear. But gradually the expedition exposed other weaknesses: impatience, arrogance, suspicion, the need to possess whatever he discovered. If the legend says the kingdom is inaccessible to someone unprepared inwardly, then perhaps those qualities are not side effects of the journey. They are the real terrain. The mountain has been examining the traveler while the traveler believed he was examining the mountain. Suddenly Shambhala's promise becomes demanding rather than comforting. Everyone wants to find the perfect kingdom. Fewer people ask whether they would belong there. A society built around wisdom cannot be entered merely by someone who wants to photograph it, claim it or prove everyone else wrong. The seeker would have to become compatible with what he seeks. That idea gives the legend extraordinary psychological durability. Technology can conquer distance but not character. Satellites can photograph valleys but not wisdom. Search engines can retrieve descriptions but cannot perform transformation on behalf of the person reading them. The better our tools become, the clearer this distinction grows. We can now see more of Earth than any previous civilization, yet knowledge of the planet has not automatically produced a wiser civilization. Perhaps that is why Shambhala still feels strangely modern. It asks whether the greatest undiscovered territory might not be hidden because we lack sufficient technology, but because we keep bringing the same unexamined human nature everywhere we go. And just when the legend seems to have moved entirely inward, one stubborn question returns: why did its storytellers give the kingdom so much geography if geography did not matter? Part 7. Could a real place be hiding inside the legend? Legends rarely emerge from nothing. They absorb landscapes, political memories, religious ideas, trade routes, fears and distant reports until their ingredients can no longer be separated easily. That makes the geographical question worth asking even if we reject the idea of a fully intact secret metropolis hiding from modern observation. Could memories of a real place have helped shape Shambhala? The possibilities stretch across a vast region. Himalayan valleys, Central Asian kingdoms, oasis civilizations and territories north or northwest of India have all encouraged speculation. A merchant hearing about a prosperous distant kingdom might repeat the story hundreds of miles away. A pilgrim could describe a monastery complex hidden behind mountains. A political center might disappear while stories about it continued traveling. After several generations, geography could merge with sacred cosmology until asking which piece came first becomes impossible. Central Asia was not an empty wilderness. Trade networks connected peoples, languages and religions across enormous distances. Buddhist communities existed in regions that modern audiences rarely associate with Buddhism. Kingdoms rose along routes linking India, Tibet, China and the Iranian world. Ideas moved with merchants and monks. Kalachakra itself emerged in a historical environment shaped by encounters among religious and political traditions. That context matters because Shambhala's story contains not only peaceful preservation but anxiety about future conflict. A hidden kingdom can function as both sacred geography and a response to historical uncertainty. But possibilities are not discoveries. No candidate location has produced evidence strong enough to close the case. This is where sensational documentaries often become impatient. They find a valley whose shape resembles a description, a local story that sounds similar, or ruins in approximately the right direction, then leap from resemblance to identification. Historia must resist that temptation because uncertainty is not a weakness in this story. It is the story. Imagine archaeologists uncovering a forgotten settlement high in the mountains. Foundations emerge from soil. Coins establish trade. Manuscripts reveal religious practice. Suddenly headlines announce Shambhala found. But archaeology asks harder questions. Does the site's date match? Do inscriptions identify it? Does the textual tradition connect to it? Can independent evidence support the claim? Extraordinary landscapes are common enough that visual resemblance proves little. The disciplined answer may be less dramatic, fascinating site, wrong conclusion. Yet something important survives even after each candidate fails. The legend has directed attention toward real histories that deserve discovery on their own terms. Hidden monasteries do not need to be Shambhala to matter. Forgotten kingdoms do not become disappointing because they are not paradise. Ancient manuscripts do not need to contain secret coordinates to transform our understanding of the past. Perhaps the search for Shambhala repeatedly teaches the same lesson in different forms. People become so desperate to find the legendary world that they overlook the extraordinary real worlds directly in front of them. Still, when evening comes and the mountains turn violet, intellectual discipline faces its oldest opponent. There is always another ridge. Another valley beyond it. Another story from someone who claims his teacher knew a route. The evidence says we have not found Shambhala. The landscape whispers that absence of discovery is not the same thing as proof of impossibility. Between those two statements, the legend continues breathing. Part 8. Why the world still needs Shambhala. By now we have traveled a long way from the simple question that began our journey. We started by asking whether a kingdom might still be hidden somewhere beyond Tibet. We found instead a tradition moving between India and Tibet, a king named Suchandra, generations of Shambhala rulers, an elaborate Kalachakra cosmology, prophecy, spiritual practice, geographical speculation and centuries of reinterpretation. Yet none of those explains completely why Shambhala still matters. To understand that, return to the image of the hidden valley. Outside the mountains, the world is unstable. Governments change. Wars destroy cities. Knowledge can be lost. Families scatter. Institutions people believed permanent disappear within a generation. Inside the mountains, something survives. Not necessarily wealth. Not immortality. Something more valuable, continuity. A society remembers what the outside world forgot. This pattern appears across human storytelling because it answers a fear older than any particular religion, the fear that everything worth preserving can be destroyed. Libraries burn. Languages disappear. Teachers die. Empires collapse. What if somewhere the essential things survived? Shambhala gives that hope a landscape. It places preservation behind mountains and asks the listener to imagine that destruction has limits. But the tradition does not leave the kingdom safely isolated forever. Its future-facing dimension means preservation eventually carries responsibility. Wisdom kept only for itself is incomplete. The hidden world must somehow matter to the broken one outside. That is what prevents Shambhala from becoming merely a luxurious escape fantasy. The kingdom is compelling because its separation has purpose. Modern audiences may translate that purpose differently. Some hear a religious promise. Others see an ideal society. Others remain fascinated by the possibility that old traditions preserve distorted memories of real geography. Still others simply love the image, somewhere beyond the known world, another way of living remains possible. We should be careful not to turn that hope into evidence. Wanting Shambhala to exist does not make a mountain valley appear. Spiritual significance does not prove physical geography. Historical respect requires us to let the tradition be complicated. But skepticism should not require contempt either. Human beings do not preserve stories for 1,000 years because they are stupid. They preserve them because stories carry structures of meaning that facts alone sometimes cannot hold. Shambhala asks questions facts cannot settle for us. What is worth preserving when civilization becomes unstable? What kind of society deserves to survive? What would a wise ruler owe the world beyond his borders? Can knowledge transform people who possess it, or does power eventually corrupt every kingdom? And perhaps most uncomfortable of all, if a better society existed, would we recognize it, or would we immediately try to own it? Those questions make the legend alive. Shambhala does not need to be hiding behind the next Himalayan ridge to confront us. Yet the mountains remain part of its power because they preserve one final possibility. We know far more about the physical earth than the people who first heard these stories. But knowing the shape of every mountain has not answered the question the mountains represented. Somewhere beyond what we have become, could human beings become something better? That is the kingdom people are still searching for. The last mountain. Dawn comes slowly at high altitude. First the stars fade. Then the black outline of the Himalayas separates from the sky. Snow peaks turn blue, then violet, then suddenly gold. On a monastery terrace, an elderly monk lights a butter lamp while younger monks open heavy wooden doors toward the morning. Somewhere below, a caravan is already moving along a trail barely visible from above. The travelers cannot see what lies beyond the next ridge. Perhaps only another valley. Perhaps another monastery. Perhaps nothing that has not already appeared on a satellite image. Farther away, clouds move through a break between the mountains, and for a moment sunlight touches something in the distance. It could be rock. It could be a roof. The distinction is impossible from here. And perhaps that is the right place to leave Shambhala. We have no archaeological evidence proving that a magnificent hidden kingdom matching the Kalachakra descriptions is physically waiting somewhere in the Himalayas. Pretending otherwise would weaken the real story. What we do have is remarkable enough, a tradition with roots reaching through medieval Indian Buddhism into Tibet, a sacred narrative in which King Suchandra receives Kalachakra teachings and carries them to Shambhala, generations of rulers preserving those teachings, descriptions of an extraordinary mountain-enclosed realm, a future prophecy that gives the kingdom a role beyond its own borders, routes that blur the boundary between physical journey and spiritual qualification, and centuries of human beings refusing to stop asking where such a place might be. Outsiders added their own dreams. Shambhala became confused with underground kingdoms, secret masters, and eventually the fictional Shangri-La. Explorers looked toward mountains. Writers transformed it. Modern culture sometimes reduced it to a lost city puzzle. Yet beneath all those additions, the older mystery survived. Shambhala was never interesting merely because it was difficult to locate. It was interesting because reaching it demanded something from the seeker. The kingdom could be imagined as real enough to journey toward and sacred enough that ordinary travel might never be sufficient. That tension protects it better than any wall. If tomorrow an expedition discovered an unknown Himalayan ruin, we would still need evidence before calling it Shambhala. If every valley on Earth were mapped perfectly, the tradition would still retain meanings no satellite could resolve. And if the kingdom was never a conventional geographical place at all, the generations who searched for it were not necessarily searching for nothing. They were pursuing an ancient human question dressed in mountains, kings, and golden roofs. Can there be a place where wisdom survives our mistakes? Maybe that is why the legend remains beautiful. The world has fewer blank spaces now, but human beings still have unfinished maps. We know how to cross mountains that once stopped armies. We can see the Earth from space. We can communicate across continents in seconds. Yet we still struggle with the same forces that frightened people centuries ago: conflict, greed, fear, division, and the possibility that knowledge alone does not make us wise. Shambhala survives because it stands on the other side of that problem. Whether it is remembered as a sacred realm, an ideal kingdom, a transformed state of being, or a distant echo of real geography, it represents the possibility that humanity has not exhausted every way of living. Somewhere beyond the world we know, perhaps geographically, perhaps spiritually, perhaps only in what human beings are still capable of becoming, the road remains unfinished. And as long as there is another mountain beyond the horizon, someone will wonder what lies behind it. If this journey gave you something worth thinking about, please like the video and subscribe to Historia. Here, we explore history not simply to collect dates, but to enter the worlds, people, and legends that still have something to tell us. Thank you for traveling with Historia. Our next story is already waiting beyond the map.